Good morning. This is Libertas once again. I'm going to talk to you today about the Great Seal of the United States of America. It's come to my attention recently that multitudes of some of the biggest names in, I guess they call themselves cyber warriors or whatever, people with these great, big, huge internet platforms now where people are doing their best to get information out. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I watch a lot of them and I know quite a few of them. But one of the things that they've gotten into recently, and I'm sure they don't know it, but when they're talking about words like Luciferian mafia and satanic cabals and Masonic cabals and such like things like that, they use a symbol in there of a pyramid and a triangular eye. And they say that that is part of the symbolism of Satanism. Well, one thing I want to remind you as Liberty Man is the embodiment of Ephesians 6, of putting on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil, and to having done all to stand. I'll remind you that in order to stand against the wiles of the devil, you have to be able to confront the devil face to face, like Jesus did in the wilderness. Anytime Satan would come up with something to tempt Jesus to get off his game, Jesus would always reply with, "It is written." So you have to be a master of the word in order to be a liberty man. But also understanding that the devil in Satan, the devil is the archangel himself that fell. Satan is his behind the scenes, subtle, um, getting into people's lives indirectly, not directly. So with that in mind, we have to be able to discern truth from error in all ways and be able to filter it through the prism of the laws of nature and nature's God, which is the Holy Bible. So I'm going to show you what that symbol means and who the people were that put it together in a thing in America called the Great Seal of the United States. We're going to start this off here. And it says right here, this is the Great Seal of the United States. And this is the depiction on the $1 bill. That's why you got all the green and the lines and all that. But they say that theys say that this symbol right here is satanic or at minimal Masonic. Masonics being a secret society, and people don't really know what all goes inside of them except the people that are part of the secret. But I'm going to go through here and I'm going to show you in detail how this came about and who ended up designing it. And hopefully it will blow your mind, but it will also show you how we're being attacked to our very core of what made America great. So if we want to make America great again, we've got to know our own symbols. So with this in mind, the Great Seal was designed originally, it looked something like this. This was a design that was done in 1776. Right after the Declaration of Independence was put together, the Continental Congress, and they called it in the Continental Congress and Convention assembled. Anyway, they commissioned John Adams Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson to commission a seal for the United States of America. And the symbolism that they used is very unique. As we've seen many times back here, resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. But here we see rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Now, this one was the one that was designed by Franklin. I'm not going to get into the one that Jefferson did, but it looks more like this. Well, this is the one that Jefferson proposed. But it also has resistance to tyrants is obedience to God around the outside of it. But in Jefferson's design, you see the children of Israel coming out of Egypt being led by a pillar of cloud. And back here in the back, you can see a pillar of fire protecting their back from the invading Egyptian army. But also right here, you see a pyramid in the background. So they're leaving Egypt and the pyramids, and they're going to the promised land. So, but with this design, you have Moses on the banks of the Red Sea. You have the pillar of fire here. And then you see Pharaoh and his army getting swamped as the Red Sea closes back in on them. And rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Over here, we see how with Jefferson's seal, you have this part of it in 1776. But you see the shields representing the 13 colonies, now states, and they are linked together, with chains, an inseparable bond with no beginning or end. You also see liberty and justice. We pledge allegiance to liberty and justice for all. So you have liberty and justice. This is a little bit of the Roman and the Greek mythology kind of things, but it's still pertinent to history. Here you see a triangular eye surrounded by these rays of light coming out of it. Then you have the 6 symbols of the 6 different nations that primarily settled America. I may get this wrong, but it's England, Scotland, Ireland, France. And between these two, one of them is the Netherlands, and I believe the other one is Germany. But they were all evangelical Christians, or what we would call them, or they were Protestant Christians for sure. There was less than 1% total of Jews and Catholics in the 13 colonies at the time of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Just the way it was. So, but anyway, we say here, e pluribus unum. But they tabled this right away. They spent all this committee spent all this time putting this together, getting the artists to render it and coming up with these great things. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. And this is a Presbyterian thing, like I showed you back here, from the Presbyterians and John Knox fighting the English back during the what they called the Covenant Wars. I think they killed like 40,000 Scots Presbyterians in that war. And I believe it was King James that did it. All over for wanting to read the Bible and live their lives according as they saw fit. Anyway, they decided to table this, and this was their reasoning. It said, we need to win the war before we need to worry about having a symbol or a seal for the United States. Right now, it's just an idea, but it's not going to mean anything if we haven't won the war. So let's win the war first, and then we'll revisit the seal. And it was a unanimous agreement. Of course, these guys were disappointed because they put so much time into it. This part here is part of John Adams' contribution with the shields. And originally he had them with their coat of arms, but that got a little too busy. And so they went with this. And then these two figures were part of, you see, their classical learning of the history of the world, but also here their biblical understanding of God. And they considered crossing the Atlantic Ocean as the crossing of the Red Sea. And if you don't believe what I'm saying about any of this stuff, I wrote a book called In God We Trusted, the U.S. Constitution and Restoration of America. You can get it at any online retailer or at LibertyMan.online. And it explains all of this in minute detail. So I'd love to take this to court and present it. But for now, I'm showing you the simplicity of it. So what they ended up doing was they came back in 1782 and revisited the Great Seal. Only this time, this was designed by a man named Charles Thompson. So we're going to spend a bit of time here discussing Charles Thompson and what it was that he brought to the table and why he was the guy that designed this and whose design that they utilized. So let's go over here to the signers of the Declaration. And we'll see here, you know, these are the famous guys. These are the guys that signed the Declaration of Independence. So let's go down here in alphabetical order. And Charles Thompson, oops, he's not in here. Well, isn't that something? So why didn't he sign it? Or did he? Let's look at this right here. This is called Dunlap's broadside. This was printed very, very soon after the Declaration of Independence, and it was sent to all the different colonies, and it was sent to George Washington up in New York, getting ready to fight the Battle of New York. So that the Continental Army would have a copy of it, and all 13 colonial legislatures at that time, they didn't know they'd become states yet because they hadn't seen this declaration. But if you'll notice down here that this is not the calligraphy handwriting that we normally see of the Declaration of Independence. That's because this was a printed publication that was in the newspapers, and also this is called a handbill, to where it's just one sheet of paper that you could hand out like a flyer. But if you'll notice at the bottom, it says, let's get it big enough to read here. Signed by order and in behalf of the Congress, John Hancock, President. So John Hancock was president of the United States at that time. That's when they became the United States, but they also date it back to 1774 with the First Continental Congress and the president of that group, which was Peyton Randolph. So here we have President John Hancock of the newly United States of America, and attested by this guy here, Charles Thompson, secretary. What's the big deal? What's the big deal? Well, it's huge. The deal is huge. If we don't know our history and we don't know who did it and why they did it, we don't know much about him. Charles Thompson was called the Samuel Adams of Pennsylvania. He was personal friends with Benjamin Franklin, Robert Morris, Thomas Mifflin, Benjamin Church, all the famous guys, John Dickinson, Robert Morris. all those famous guys that signed the Declaration of Independence and were colonial leaders in Philadelphia and revolutionary generals and all these different things that we hear about, they're written about, but nobody hears about Charles Thompson. Anyway, to start with Charles Thompson, he began his time in America at age 9 years old. His mother had died in town of Ulster, Ireland. His dad took him and his brothers and sisters, I think there were 5 or 6 of them, and he was going to bring them over here to start over again in America. He had some assets here that he had acquired. And anyway, the father died within sight of the harbor in New Jersey. So that left these children orphans. Well, once they got on the docks, they were orphans. And so they ended up becoming dependents. And so what they did was they sold them as, or indentured them to a family or somebody that would take care of them. So, but being an indentured servant to someone meant that they were a slave. So this man, Charles Thompson, right here, started off his time in America at 9 years old as a slave. Now, years later, he became an apprentice, and he left at some point as a very young person, and he was walking to go to Philadelphia, where there was a bigger town, so he could get a better education. And he basically was hitchhiking, and this eccentric lady picked him up. They had a conversation they were riding, and she said, I will take care of you, and I will give you an endowment to go to this certain school, which they called back then a grammar school. This is where you would be prepared for college. It's above the reading and basic math and that type of stuff. But they would learn Latin so that they could read the classics and the histories of the world. And so that they could also, and then they also learned Greek so that they could read the Bible in the originals. So the purpose of this type of education, things get lost in translation, right? So they wanted to read the histories and the Bible in the originals, in the original languages. They were that serious about all these things. And these are for kids that would normally be 6th, 7th, and 8th graders in our day and time. This is what they would do. And they would have to do this to get into college. Well, this guy here, Charles Thompson, he fell in love with the Greek language. And he asked somebody, who are the greatest teachers about the Bible? And so they listed a number of great scholars. A lot of them were scholars at Oxford in England and other places, Edinburgh, with the Presbyterians there in Glasgow. And Charles Thompson said, well, who taught them? Where'd they get their ideas? And they said, well, from reading the Bible. And he goes, well, I'll just do that. I'll just read the Bible, and I won't read what somebody else said about it. I'll just read it myself. So he ended up becoming a teacher after he graduated, and he stayed there for a number of years. But he decided that if he was going to get married, he needed to make more money. So he started a import company and did very well for himself. And then his first wife died, and he married a second wife and became very wealthy with her inheritances. But he also did extremely well with his mercantile business. Well, in 1765, we had the Stamp Act. Well, he didn't like that. You know, it was hurting his business. It was hurting his pocketbook because he was a merchant. So he got involved in the political thing with fighting back against the Stamp Act and all these different taxation things that Britain was trying to do to America to help them pay for the French and Indian War. Well, Charles Thompson was considered the Samuel Adams of Philadelphia. It's very likely that without this guy's influence, that because of the great influence of the Quakers in Pennsylvania, it was very unlikely that they would have been involved much with the revolution until absolutely forced into it. Anyway, he was very instrumental in that. He's the one that set up the committees of correspondence that became part of Massachusetts and New England, and then spread from there to all the other colonies. And that's how they were able to communicate back and have a unified front when the stuff finally hit the fan with Lexington and Concord. Anyway, Charles Thompson was such a man of such incredible character and incredible trustworthiness that during the Indian affairs, he was personally requested by this certain Indian of the Delaware tribes who felt that he was getting abused by the government with some trade deals. And so he finally said, look, I'm not going to treat any more with you until I have Charles Thompson be the secretary that records the records. It's not going to happen. I'll just take my people and we'll leave and we'll just fight it out. Well, they didn't want to do that. And so through some haranguing and stuff, that the governor of Pennsylvania at the time decided, okay, we'll give the Indians what they want and we'll let him have Charles Thompson do the records. Because of that and other type of business dealings, this man name and reputation became as good as gold. And there's different poems written about him, things on his tombstone written about him along those lines, that his word was as good as gold. And to attest to something, we would call that today as a notary. He would notarize it. But see, he's putting his name on this document saying, I attest to the truthfulness of this document. I attest to the authenticity of this document and the validity of this document. So with that in mind, he got this position in 1774. I haven't found any records of him being elected to the Continental Congress. His biography, which is this right here, this book here, called The Life of Charles Thompson, you can get it at archives.com, or you can get it on Google Books for free in another other online libraries. It's a fantastic work about a fantastic man that should be extremely well known, as you'll see when we get through this. Anyway, as we saw here, he did not sign the Declaration of Independence as one of the voters. He did sign it over here to attest to it. All right, so this is the official document that he attested to. The one that they signed was more ceremonial. Okay, so he's getting out of his biography says that he was getting out of his carriage to drop his wife off at their home in the city of Philadelphia, which was just a few blocks away from Carpenter's Hall, where they had the first Continental Congress in 1774. And he was notified at that point that he had been unanimously chosen to be the secretary for the Congress. Well, the record says that he got his wife settled in the house, had his servant put his horse and buggy away, and he immediately went over to the original Congress. And he took 5 days before he actually started doing the recording. And you can tell by the original documents when it changed handwriting. But from day one, this man was part of the Continental Congress. Now, he did not miss a meeting for 15 years. He recorded every word that was spoken in the Continental Congress. He knew everything that was talked about in that Congress that led up to independence and the Declaration of Independence, of fighting the war, of Thomas Jefferson writing the um, Northwest Ordinance that became the rules to admit new states into the Union. And his last act, we will see right here, since we're talking about it. When in 1789, when they had the first elections to get the officers for the Senate and the Congress and the House of Representatives to go to, back down then it was New York, to start the new government under the Constitution, then the votes for the electors were sent to the Senate after all this was assembled. But the votes for president were sent and opened in the Senate, and it was unanimous that the electors of all 13 colonies had elected George Washington unanimously to be the president. The responsibility to deliver that message to George Washington fell on Charles Thompson. So he was entrusted with one of the most significant events in American history, and that is the election and swearing in of the new president. So when he went there, he gave George Washington the notification that he had been unanimously elected president. And I have some records that alluded to the fact that he was like, oh, darn it. But my country calls, I'll go do it. So Charles Thompson escorted him back to New York, presented him to the Senate, and then that was his last official act as the secretary for the Continental Congress. And it says here, by direction of Washington, Thompson delivered the books, records, and papers of the Continental Congress, the Great Seal of the Federal Union, and the Seal of the Admiralty to Mr. Roger Alden, the Deputy Secretary of Congress. And it says here that he had spent 15 years, had passed in the service of his country through a most eventful period, and his retirement could not fail to attract considerable attention. Anyway, this guy, how he got passed over for a administrative position in the newly elected Congress just baffled everybody. He petitioned Washington, he petitioned the Senate, he petitioned everybody, but it finally just came down to it, and Washington finally just conceded and says, look, you just didn't get elected. I don't know why. It doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, what's done is done. So what Charles Thompson did after that was he went home and he got out his Greek book, and he took the Septuagint text of the Holy Bible that was written in like the 5th century, where they translated the Old Testament and some of the Gospels and parts of the New Testament into Greek. And they did it at Alexandria. And so that because too few people could read Hebrew. So they had these scholars translate it into Greek. So what Charles Thompson did for the rest of his life almost was he translated the Greek Septuagint into what is now called the Thompson Bible. So Charles Thompson not only was a great leader in America, but he was also one of the most famous Christian scholars ever. He had no formal doctorate degree. He didn't go to any fancy universities. He did this on his own in conjunction with Thomas Jefferson, Joseph Priestley, Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Rush, and many other great, great leaders. But anyway, that was his contribution to the United States, was his translation of the Septuagint into the Thompson Bible. And that's a whole nother story in and of itself. But this is what we're going to concentrate on: the Great Seal of the Federal Union. So, with all of that background in mind about Charles Thompson and his integrity, his what he did for the Continental Congress, he was there every day. He knew more about what went on in the governmental affairs of the United States than any other human being alive. George Washington was only there for a couple of years. Thomas Jefferson came in and out. Sam Adams was only there for a few years. And they just, especially after the war started, it was turnover every year. Have a new group of people every year come in for the most part. So when it comes to the symbolism of the United States of America, not only did he know the governmental significance of everything, but he also knew the spiritual significance of everything that they did. So you ready? Here we go. This is the absolute concrete truth. It's non-debatable about the seal of the United States of America, and has absolutely nothing to do anything outside of the Holy Bible itself. Hopefully I got your attention. Starts here with Novus Ordo Seclorum. This is a Latin phrase. It has a legal meaning that's not debatable. That's why Latin is used. It's a dead language, so it translates the same in every other language in the world. It is defined the same. People say today this is the New World Order, Seclorum, Novus Ordo Seclorum. So they say this is secular, a new secular order. George Bush is the first, constantly talking about the New World Order, New World Order, New World Order. And they're quoting this. Okay. President of the United States lying his ass off to the American people. Novus Ordo Seclorum means a new era for the ages. And it has to do with this right here. This is 1776. The United States instituted a new era for the ages. The historians said that the United States, what this Novus Ordo Seclorum means, was the United States was the first nation in the history of the world that recognized the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, the laws of nature and nature's God, and endowed by our Creator here. So if you want to know more about what I just said about endowed by our Creator and the laws of nature and nature's God, we did a video called Are You Smarter Than a First Grader? And the definitions of those are in there. But to briefly recap, endowed by our Creator means that man is a created being and he must be subject to the laws of his Creator. The laws of nature and nature's God, condensed, is no human law is valid if it contradicts the Bible. So our foundation of our country is the laws of nature and nature's God, not Judeo-Christian principles, Judeo-Christian ethics or morals. It was founded upon the scriptures of the Old and New Testament of the Holy Bible. Get that through your thick skulls and listen to what I just told you. If you start talking about Judeo-Christian principles, ethics, or morals, it puts the debate in the realm of philosophy. This is not in the realm of philosophy. This is the realm of bedrock truth. Okay? And I'll do a teaching on that and tell you how that language crept into our system through the education system by changing the words and adding words. Just like we're taught all day long about American democracy is under attack. Well, you dang well right it is, because we live in a republic. It has nothing to do with democracy. That's another teaching for another day. Anyway, Here's the foundation, and this is the pyramid. This is a pyramid going back to the Moses story and the children of Israel. But the reason they chose the pyramid is because it was the oldest man-made structure still in existence today that had weathered the test of time. And they believe that the Jews actually had a hand in building it. But anyway, America is built on the foundation of the Declaration of Independence. There are 13 layers of the pyramid, but here there's a gap between the capstone and the pyramid, meaning it's unfinished. Today we have 50 states. My state of Mississippi came on board in 1817, and Alaska and Hawaii came on board in 1959, the year that I was born. So they've only been a part of this for 59 years, 61 years, excuse me, 1959. So anyway, this is the overwatching eye of divine providence. Has nothing to do with anything non-biblical whatsoever. Let me state that again. This symbolism is the Christian symbolism of the overwatching eye of divine providence. Why? Where does this have to do with this? We'll go back over here. It says here, the founding fathers said that they would not sign this document without adding this phrase, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. They knew the stories of the Old Testament where it came down to a challenge of the gods. David and Goliath. Daniel in the lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the burning fiery furnace. It came down to where the gods would decide the contest. And in each of those events, and also you had Elijah and the 450 prophets of Baal. It was who's got the biggest, baddest God, whose God is going to be watching out for the affairs, whose God is bigger than the other God. Follow me? So they said, we are going to sign this with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So that's where that eye of providence comes in with the symbolism of America. Annuit coeptis is another Latin phrase which means God has ruled in our favor. Go back to this, and that comes from right here. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assemble, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. They had exhausted every physical means of redress of grievances. They listed them once again in the Declaration of Independence in those 27 grievances, and said, you've ignored us in all of these cases. We're taking our case to the throne of God. And they said, without God, we don't have a prayer. So we're depending on divine providence to rule in our favor. So that's where this comes in, that God did in fact rule in our favor. Further proof of this was when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, he had his band play The World Turned Upside Down, which is a verse of scripture where in Ephesus, they were going around blaming the Christians for starting all the riots, saying, these people that have come here have turned the world upside down, teaching that there's no other king but Jesus. And that was the motto of the American Revolution, no king but Jesus. So God has ruled in our favor. The people that have come here have turned the world upside down because God has ruled in their favor against the mightiest nation in the history of the world. Can't make this stuff up, folks, but the truth is a lot better than fiction. Gets better. Here we go. The front of it is the shield. This part comes from John Adams. And we see the 13 stripes and 13 stripes, 13 leaves, 13 berries, 13 arrows. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I think this might represent the original Union in 1754, and where they had 9 states show up, and they had the rattlesnake that was cut in pieces saying join or die. But the American eagle represented the majesty of the country, and you have the 13 stars, and then once again you have the cloud and the glory of God. So these are the constellations in heaven now of God's deliverance. And we see E pluribus unum. Now, E pluribus unum gives me chill bumps. When I first found this, I had to go sit on the beach for hours, just staring at the stars, asking God, what have I stumbled in on? But it's very humbling, and I hope that you get what I'm trying to convey here, because this is probably the most important sentence that you'll ever read about American government. This is the only way to fix America. We hear today about diversity and inclusiveness and all of these crazy, crazy ideas that are doing nothing but tearing us apart. Just the word diversity in and of itself is divisive. It's divisive. It's not unifying in any way, shape, or form. But E pluribus unum, the literal translation of Latin, is out of many. Pluribus, E is out of many, unum, one. Out of many, one. Okay, one what? We don't speak Latin in our vernacular, so it doesn't translate the way we would talk. But here's what the Supreme Court of the United States said about it. They said in a case called Holy Trinity v. U.S. in 1892, that cites all of these different things I said in here about this seal and the symbolism in it, that the United States is a Christian nation. But they said about E pluribus unum, and that E pluribus unum was the answer to this here. John 17:21. This was the prayer of Jesus Christ after the Last Supper. He's praying to his Father before they get up from the table and go to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's not going to see him again until after his resurrection. So he says this prayer. He says that they all may be one, as thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you have sent me. Supreme Court of the United States said E pluribus unum was the fulfillment of that prayer. Let that sink in. E pluribus unum is the unity that Jesus had with his Father, that we would have that same unity. And because of that unity, the whole world would know that God had sent Jesus to be the Savior. E pluribus unum. So hopefully that sinks in, and we'll continue in this journey of Liberty Man and the restoration of America. But this is a great place to start. Amen. God bless.